The hum of the refrigerator was the only witness. When I found the unsigned divorce papers my daughter had slipped onto my kitchen table. Still, I kept my hand resting on the cold metal edge, steadying myself instead of tearing the papers apart. As the low vibration deepened, it felt like the house itself was holding its breath with me. While that hum pressed against the silence, I realized how long I'd ignored the warning signs she thought I wouldn't see. The same quiet tremor revealed the truth. Betrayal doesn't shout, it echoes. That's when I decided her signature wouldn't be the only one missing from the life she tried to abandon. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Father's Day began in the quiet way Robert always preferred. Soft morning light slipping through the blinds, the gentle clatter of Sarah moving around the kitchen, and the familiar scent of pancakes warming the house. At 58, Robert no longer expected grand gestures or elaborate surprises. Peace was enough. When he walked into the kitchen and found a modest breakfast set neatly on the table, pancakes, scrambled eggs, and one perfectly brewed cup of coffee, he felt that small, comforting warmth he'd come to treasure. Sarah smiled at him in that patient, reassuring way she always had, as if trying to hold their entire family together with her eyes alone. "Happy Father's Day," she said softly. He kissed her forehead, grateful for the simplicity, grateful for her. For a moment, everything felt settled, steady, like maybe this year would pass without a crack forming in places he didn't know were fragile. But the calm evaporated the moment Charlotte's car pulled into the driveway. Robert heard the engine before he saw her. A sleek luxury SUV, David's influence, no doubt. Charlotte stepped out in designer sunglasses and heels too delicate for the suburban concrete. She was 30 now, married into wealth, floating in a world far shinier than the one she'd grown up in. Yet she greeted her mother warmly and walked into the house with the confidence of someone who had long stopped seeing the cracks in her own behavior. "Dad," she smiled thinly, holding a small envelope, "got something for you." Robert took it, hoping for something meaningful. Instead, when he unfolded the slip of paper inside, he felt something inside him twist. A bus ticket. One way, no note, no explanation, no warmth. Before he had time to process it, Charlotte turned toward David, her father-in-law, who followed behind her carrying a gift-wrapped box the size of a shoebox. She took it from him with a flourish, turning the moment into a scene, and handed it back to him like a game show hostess revealing a prize. "Happy Father's Day, Dad," she said, but this dad sounded warm, polished, practiced. David opened the box, and inside were the keys to a brand new luxury sedan. He laughed, delighted, and pulled Charlotte into a hug. The sound of their celebration filled the room, loud enough to drown the small crack that had just split through Robert's chest. For a few seconds, Robert didn't move. The bus ticket felt heavier than the keys Charlotte had just gifted away. It wasn't just the gift, it was the message underneath it. The careless disregard. The distance she no longer tried to hide. He forced a smile, but his voice cracked slightly when he said, "A bus ticket, huh?" Charlotte shrugged as if it were nothing. "It's just a joke, Dad. Don't take it so seriously." A joke, that was what she called it. Something meant to be laughed at. Something he was expected to accept like it didn't sting. But all he could think about were the years, decades. He'd worked double shifts to put her through school. The nights he'd driven an aging pickup through storms just to pick her up safely from work. The savings he'd drained to help her move into her first apartment. The moments he'd sacrificed without hesitation, without resentment, because she was his daughter, his pride, his purpose. And now she stood in front of him, gifting luxury to someone else and mockery to him. He didn't trust what he might say if he opened his mouth again. Sarah saw it first, the stiffening in his shoulders, the tightness around his jaw. She knew him well enough to recognize the storm forming behind his eyes. "Charlotte," she said gently, "maybe that wasn't the best idea." Charlotte rolled her eyes, dismissive. "Oh, please, Mom. Dad knows I didn't mean anything by it." But she didn't look at him when she said it. She didn't check his expression. She didn't try to soften the blow. She simply moved on, laughing again with David, the man who had replaced Robert in her orbit without ever earning the right. Sarah touched Robert's arm. "Let it go," she whispered, hoping to ease him, hoping to keep the day from unraveling. But something had already shifted inside him. A quiet, controlled heaven. Settled across his chest, not explosive, not dramatic, just decisive. He realized with a kind of painful clarity that the distance between him and Charlotte wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't temporary. It wasn't even accidental. It was chosen by her. And for the first time, he felt the urge not to chase after her, not to justify himself, not to swallow the hurt for the sake of keeping peace. He felt the urge to stop accepting this version of fatherhood she had forced upon him. He folded the bus ticket and slipped it into his pocket, letting the weight of it sit there like a quiet warning. Something inside him hardened, not out of anger but out of necessity. And as Charlotte continued laughing with her father-in-law, unaware of the shift she had triggered, Robert made a silent promise to himself. He would not let this go. Not this time. And whether Charlotte realized it or not, Father's Day had just changed everything. For the rest of Father's Day, Robert moved through the house like a man underwater, silent, heavy, unable to shake the weight pressing down on him. He slipped into the backyard, settling into the old wooden chair that had seen better years, and let the distant hum of traffic fill the quiet he couldn't find inside himself. The bus ticket, now tucked into his shirt pocket, felt like a stone against his chest. Every time he shifted, he felt it, and every time he felt it, the sting returned. He didn't cry, didn't raise his voice, didn't even sigh. He just sat there, steeped in a kind of disappointment that hollowed him out from the inside. Charlotte didn't notice, or rather she chose not to. After the awkwardness of the morning, she moved on quickly, slipping back into her comfortable rhythm with David and Jard. To her, the moment was already fading into irrelevance, something she would later describe as Dad being sensitive again. While Robert sat alone, replaying the humiliation over and over, Charlotte drove off in David's car without a second thought, laughing at something Jard said, her sunglasses shielding her from whatever trace of guilt might have flickered across her eyes. Inside the house, Sarah watched Robert through the kitchen window. She recognized his withdrawal too well, the way he locked himself inside his thoughts, the way he refused to let anyone pull him out. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and stepped onto the patio. "Robert," she murmured, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, "don't let this ruin the day. She didn't mean to hurt you." He didn't look at her. Then why did she? Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes she tries too hard to impress David. She forgets how it comes across. "She gave him a car," Robert said, voice low. "She gave me a bus ticket." Sarah couldn't argue with that. She sat beside him, hoping silence might speak where words failed. But Robert's mind was already spiraling, replaying Charlotte's shrug, her dismissive smile, the way she said it was just a joke, as if his dignity were a punchline. As the hours passed, anger took root, not loud, not explosive, but simmering deep in his chest like slow-burning coals. He kept seeing Charlotte handing David those car keys, her voice rich with affection he hadn't heard directed at him in years. He kept seeing David's smug satisfaction as he flaunted the gift, a silent reminder of the gap between the worlds they came from. And then there was the bus ticket, cheap, thoughtless, symbolic of exactly how small his worth seemed in her eyes. In the early afternoon, when the tension finally pushed him to reach for his phone, he called Charlotte, not to fight, not to scold, just to try and understand. The call rang twice before going to voicemail. He tried again, straight to voicemail. On the third attempt, he realized she wasn't ignoring her phone. She was ignoring him. A few minutes later, through the open window, he heard Sarah's phone buzz on the counter. A notification lit up the screen, Charlotte calling. Not Robert, not the father she'd wounded. She was calling her father-in-law instead, choosing the easier conversation, the easier man. Robert looked away, jaw tightening. That subtle act, so small, so telling, poured gasoline on the fire already burning inside him. Meanwhile, David seemed to sense none of the tension he'd inadvertently fueled. Later that evening, he sent photos of the car to the family group chat, captioned with a tone-deaf message. "Look what my amazing daughter-in-law surprised me with." Charlotte reacted instantly with heart emojis. Robert didn't respond at all. Then came a second message from David, casual and cutting at the same time. "Robert, maybe I can give you a ride sometime. That bus ticket must not get you far." Followed by a winking emoji. Robert stared at the screen until his vision blurred. The humiliation doubled back on him, sharper this time, because it wasn't just the gift anymore, it was the public spectacle of it. The implication that he was less. Sir, the expectation that he would laugh along. He locked his phone and set it face down. By sundown, the quiet of the morning was long gone. The air in the house felt thick, heavy with tension that had no voice yet demanded space. Robert sat at the dining table, elbows resting on the wood he'd sanded and stained himself years earlier, thinking about the kind of father he'd been: patient, present, willing, and the kind of man Charlotte now treated as optional. He felt something harden inside him, not out of spite, but out of necessity. He couldn't keep allowing her to walk over him with indifference disguised as modern humor. He couldn't keep waiting for her to see the harm she caused. No, this time she would understand, whether she wanted to or not. And as the night settled around him, Robert made a decision that would change everything the next time they spoke. Robert didn't sleep the night after Father's Day. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the look on Charlotte's face, carefree, indifferent, untouched by the hurt she had carved into him with one careless gesture. By sunrise, exhaustion had hollowed him out, but clarity had taken its place. He needed to speak to her, but not through another strained phone call she would ignore. He needed to say everything he'd swallowed over the years, every disappointment, every sacrifice she had forgotten. So he sat at the dining table with a pen and a blank sheet of paper, the morning still quiet around him. Slowly, deliberately, he began to write. He told her about the first time he worked a double shift just to pay for her school trip, and how seeing her excited face made the fatigue worth it. He told her about the nights he stayed up late fixing her first car, hands numb from the cold because she needed it for work the next morning. He wrote about the dinners she skipped, the calls she stopped returning, the holidays she rushed through as if he were an obligation instead of a father. And then he wrote about the bus ticket, the moment that made every unspoken wound split open. By the time he finished, his hand ached and his eyes burned, but he felt lighter. The letter wasn't angry or dramatic. It was honest, painfully so. He folded it carefully, placed it in an envelope, then set it aside. He wasn't ready to send it, not yet, maybe not ever. Meanwhile, Charlotte seemed to drift even further away. Days passed with no call, no apology, not even the slightest acknowledgement of what happened. Instead, her social media brimmed with dinners at expensive restaurants, charity galas, weekend trips with Jard and David. She looked happy effortlessly, carelessly happy, as if her actions had no consequence, as if her father's pain was a nuisance she could ignore until it vanished. Robert watched from a distance, each new photo tightening something inside him. She had built a life so far from the one he'd worked to give her that he barely recognized the person she had become. Then on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Jard called. "Robert, can we talk?" Robert hesitated but answered. Jard's voice carried a gentleness Robert respected, even if he didn't fully trust it now. "I know things got out of hand," Jard said. "Charlotte, she didn't mean to upset you. Maybe we can all sit down together, work it out." Robert felt the old instinct tug at him, the instinct to smooth things over, to bend for the sake of peace. But something inside him resisted. "Jard," he said, steady and tired, "this isn't yours to fix. I'm just trying to help." She needs to be the one to come to me, Robert cut in. Not you, not Sarah, not anyone else, her. Jard was silent for a moment before offering a reluctant, "I understand," though his tone said he didn't fully. They ended the call politely, but the conversation only deepened Robert's resolve. Mediation wasn't the answer. Apologies delivered second-hand meant nothing. Meanwhile, David continued his quiet, corrosive influence. At a weekend barbecue, with neighbors and relatives milling around, David made offhand comments that landed with the subtlety of a blade. He joked about working-class wisdom, about simple gifts for simple men, about how some people don't understand modern humor. The smirk that accompanied each remark made the meaning painfully clear. People laughed, unsure or unwilling to challenge him. Robert simply walked away, jaw locked, his dignity held in place only by silence. But inside, resentment coiled tighter. He had spent years shrinking himself, minimizing his hurt, telling himself that Charlotte would come around, that she just needed time. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. She wasn't drifting away by accident. She was choosing a world in which he existed only on the margins, a world where his love no longer mattered. The final push came unexpectedly. Charlotte texted him, brief, shallow, dismissive. "Dad," Jard said, "you're upset. You're overreacting. It was a joke. Let it go." Those words, "let it go," felt like a slap. There was no acknowledgement of his letter, no curiosity about how he felt, no attempt at understanding. She hadn't even asked if he was okay. She simply wanted him quiet. Robert set down his phone and stared at the wall for a long moment. Then he reached for the envelope containing the letter he hadn't sent. His hand hovered over it, not to mail it, but to remind himself of the truth he had written. He had spent his life giving Charlotte everything he had, and she had learned to give him nothing in return. Slowly, deliberately, he slid the letter back into the drawer. Words weren't going to reach her. Not anymore. What she needed wasn't another plea, another explanation, another attempt at peace. She needed to feel the weight of her actions in a way she couldn't laugh off or dismiss with a text message. And in that quiet moment, something sharp and clear settled inside him. He would act. He would make her understand. And the plan forming in his mind, the upgrade he intended to deliver, would be the first step. A step she would never see coming. Robert waited 3 days before acting, not out of hesitation but out of calculation. He needed his mind clear, his emotions steady. On the 4th morning he drove to the bus depot, the same place he had spent years shuttling between work shifts, overtime and responsibilities that never seemed to end. The smell of diesel, the low rumble of engines, the faces of people heading anywhere but home, it all stirred an old ache inside him. He walked up to the counter and placed Charlotte's original bus ticket on the scratched plastic surface. "I'd like to upgrade this," he said. The clerk glanced at the ticket, then at him. "Destination." Robert shook his head once. "Nowhere." The clerk hesitated, unsure whether he was joking. But when he saw Robert's unreadable expression, he understood. "We can convert it to an unassigned, one-way, non-refundable travel credit. No location listed." "Do it," Robert said. It took less than 5 minutes. When the clerk slid the newly printed slip across the counter, it felt colder than the first. A ticket not to someplace, but away from everything. A quiet message Charlotte couldn't mistake if she bothered to look past her pride. He didn't smile. He didn't second-guess himself. He simply folded the slip, slipped it into a small envelope and mailed it to her home. No note, no explanation. Later that evening, his phone buzzed. The message was short. "What is this?" A second followed. "Dad, seriously." Charlotte called next. He let it ring twice before answering. "Why did you send me this?" she demanded, not angry, confused, offended, inconvenienced. "It's your bus ticket," Robert said calmly. "Upgraded." "To nothing," she snapped. "What does that even mean?" "That you're running from this family," he said, "from me, and if that's what you want, then here's your ticket, one way." Charlotte scoffed at him, an old habit that struck him like a slap. "Dad, stop being dramatic. It was a joke. This thing you sent, it's ridiculous." His voice stayed level. "Charlotte, this is your only option if you keep treating me the way you do. Indifference has a destination too." Before she could argue, he ended the call. Not angrily, just finally. Sarah had heard enough from the next room to know this wasn't going to fade quietly. She joined him in the living room, lowering herself slowly onto the couch beside him. "Robert," she murmured, "I know you're hurt, and I understand, I really do. But do you think this will bring her closer or push her further away?" He didn't look at her. "I've spent years being patient, years letting her walk past me like I'm furniture. I'm not starting another year like that." Sarah reached for his hand but hesitated halfway, as if touching him might fracture something even further. I don't want this to be the moment that breaks what little you two have left." "It already broke," he said quietly. "I'm just acknowledging it." Before Sarah could answer, the doorbell rang. When Robert opened the door, Jard stood there, uneasy, hands in his pockets, eyes flickering with concern. "Robert, can we talk?" Robert stepped aside but remained guarded. Jard exhaled slowly. "Look, Charlotte's upset. She thinks this whole ticket thing is you trying to punish her." Robert didn't blink. "It's not punishment, it's clarity." "Okay," Jard said carefully, "but maybe you could explain it to her without whatever this is." Robert's patience thinned. "Jard, you can't fix this. She has to." "I know," Jard said, voice softening, "but she's scared she pushed you too far." "She did," Robert replied, "and she still doesn't understand how far." Jard had no response. Eventually, he nodded, defeated, and left with the heaviness of someone who knew both sides but belonged to neither. But the night wasn't finished with Robert yet. An hour later, David called. His voice held that smooth arrogance Robert had grown to despise. "Robert, I heard a boo. To your little stunt with the ticket. Don't you think you're taking this a bit too personally?" Robert closed his eyes. "David, this doesn't concern you." "Oh, but it does," David said lightly. "Charlotte is family, my family, and this emotional theatrics you're pulling, well, it's not exactly what a stable father would do." Robert's jaw tightened. "You wouldn't understand." "You're right," David said with a soft chuckle. "I don't understand what it's like to cling to pride because you don't have much else." The remark hit as intended. A clean, practiced humiliation from a man who had never worked a day of his life the way Robert had. Robert ended the call without a word. When he finally sat down again, the house felt colder. Sarah tried to approach him, but he lifted a hand gently, asking for silence. He needed space, not from her, but from the noise everyone else had turned his pain into. The next morning, Charlotte messaged him again. "Dad, I'm not doing this. You always take things too far. I'm not entertaining this ticket nonsense." Her confidence was almost breathtaking. She truly believed he would fold, as he always had. But this time, Robert felt nothing soften inside him. If she thought the ticket was an empty threat, she was about to learn how wrong she was. Robert wrote the final letter on a night when the house felt too quiet, as if even the walls were waiting for him to finally accept what had been true for years. He didn't pace this time. He didn't agonize over the words. They came to him steadily, like water finally finding its path. He wrote about the exhaustion of loving someone who held him at arm's length. He wrote about her dismissals, her indifference, the way she always assumed he would still be there no matter how deeply she cut. Then he wrote the line that hurt him most to admit. "I've stopped hoping you'll ever understand me." When he finished, he folded the letter with a kind of ceremony, slid it into an envelope and drove it to Charlotte's house just before sunrise. The street was silent, the sky half awake. He walked up to her doorstep, placed the envelope where she couldn't miss it, and left without knocking. For the first time in years, he didn't wait for her reaction. He didn't need one. Charlotte found the letter 2 hours later. She picked it up expecting another jab, another confusing message from her father's midlife emotional storm. But the moment she began reading, her expression shifted. The casual dismissiveness drained away, replaced by something far heavier. The words weren't angry. They were tired, final, the tone of a man who had already stepped away emotionally and didn't plan on turning back. By the time she finished, something inside her cracked just enough for regret to seep through. She sat on the couch, the letter trembling slightly in her hands as she read one sentence over and over. "There is nothing left for me to explain." For the first time, her defenses faltered, and she felt a hollow ache she couldn't immediately justify or ignore. Meanwhile, Robert spent the morning in a strange, eerie calm. It wasn't peace, not yet, but a release. He made coffee, trimmed a few branches in the backyard, and moved through the day as if a weight he had been carrying no longer belonged to him. He didn't wait for a text. He didn't check his phone. He knew the letter had landed exactly the way it needed to. Whether she understood it or not no longer felt like his burden. Jard, however, was far from calm. When Charlotte finally told him about the letter, frustration bubbled up inside him. He had spent months trying to keep the peace, trying to balance the emotional gravitational pull between a wounded father and a defensive daughter. But now he found himself squarely in Charlotte's corner, even though he could see, for the first time, the truth behind Robert's anger. "Why didn't he just talk to you?" Jard demanded, pacing the living room. Charlotte shook her head, voice tight. "He says he tried. He says I don't listen." "And do you?" Jard shot back before he could stop himself. Her silence answered him. At the same time, David sensed an opportunity, a shift he could tilt in his favor. Over dinner that evening, he made subtle remarks masked as sympathy. "Your father has always been sensitive," David said casually, slicing into his meal with surgical precision. "Men like him don't do well when their children outgrow them." Charlotte frowned. "This isn't about outgrowing him." David lifted a brow as though humoring her. "Of course, but you can't hold yourself back just because he feels inferior." The seed planted itself effortlessly. David never attacked directly. His talent lay in gentle corruption, nudging, suggesting, letting insecurity do the rest. And the more he spoke, the further Robert's image slipped in Charlotte's mind. But later that night, when Charlotte called Robert, her voice carried an unfamiliar softness. "Dad, I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean to hurt you." It was the end of apology most people would accept, but Robert heard the thinness beneath it, the caution, the convenience, not remorse, not understanding. "I appreciate the words," he answered evenly, "but I don't believe you understand what you're apologizing for." She grew irritated. "Dad, why can't you just accept it? I said I'm sorry." "That's not the same as meaning it," he said, his tone calm enough to sting. "You're apologizing to end the conversation, not because you see what you've done." Her breath hitched, offense rising like a shield. "You're being unfair." "No," he said, "just honest." He ended the call before she could respond. Charlotte stared at her phone, stunned. She had expected him to soften, to bend like he always did. Instead, he had shut the door she assumed would always stay open for her. The realization punched through her defensiveness. She hadn't lost an argument. She had lost her father's trust. And as she sat alone, letter beside her, she felt a truth she had spent years avoiding finally catch up to her. She had pushed him too far, and he was no longer reaching back. Robert, however, felt nothing but certainty. For the first time, he knew he was right to walk away. Charlotte never imagined silence could feel this loud. In the days following her father's rejection, she found herself checking her phone more than she cared to admit, waiting for a message that never came, hoping he'd soften first, the way he always had. When he didn't, desperation nudged her into motion. She began sending him small gifts, an expensive watch, a gourmet fruit basket, a bottle of his favorite scotch. Each delivery was neat, polished, impersonal. And each time Robert opened one, he felt nothing but a deeper ache. The gifts weren't apologies. They were shortcuts, attempts to buy her way back into a place she had walked out of long ago. He placed them all on a side table, unopened except for the initial glance. A row of hollow gestures, each one a reminder of how far she still was from understanding him. Charlotte, unaware of the growing distance her attempts created, kept pushing. She left voicemails with a brightness that sounded forced even to her. "Dad, I thought you'd love this, call me." But behind the cheerful tone was a rising panic she couldn't quite hide. The more he didn't respond, the more she tried to fill the gap with things, anything that could patch over the crack widening between them. But Robert stayed unmoved. His silence wasn't meant to punish her. It was self-preservation. After the years of bending to her moods, of accepting whatever scraps of attention she tossed his way, he now found a strange comfort in the quiet. For the first time, he didn't feel obligated to chase reconciliation. He didn't feel responsible for fixing what she had broken. Instead, he let the distance sit exactly where she had placed it, refusing to be manipulated by shiny offers or hollow words. David noticed the shift immediately, and he didn't like it. The authority he once held over Charlotte seemed to wobble every time she mentioned her father now, her voice tinged with concern instead of the usual dismissive humor. David began exploiting the tension with his signature blend of subtlety and arrogance. At dinner one evening, he leaned across the table and said, "You know, Charlotte, some people sulk when they feel outgrown. It's a pride thing. Your father is acting exactly as I expected." Charlotte stiffened. "It's not about outgrowing him." David smiled lightly, almost pitying. "Of course it's not, but men like him struggle with children who become successful. It threatens their identity." The words slithered between them, planting doubt where vulnerability already lived. He didn't raise his voice, didn't insult Robert directly, but the implication was sharp enough to draw blood. Robert was jealous, petty, incapable of handling her success. Charlotte didn't argue, but the discomfort stayed with her long after the conversation ended. Meanwhile, Jard was beginning to see the situation differently. He watched Charlotte spiral through anxiety, frustration, and denial, cycling between blaming Robert and blaming herself. He watched Robert, too, steadfast, quiet, resolute. And slowly, painfully, Jard began to understand that the fracture between father and daughter wasn't sudden. It had been building for years. He found himself torn between wanting to support his wife and recognizing that she had been blind to her own cruelty. The truth sat heavily on him. Robert's anger wasn't unwarranted. It was overdue. So he stepped back. He offered Charlotte presents but not excuses, comfort but not justification. It confused her at first. She had expected him to defend her, to uphold the narrative she'd always leaned on, that Robert was overreacting, that she had done nothing wrong. But Jard couldn't pretend anymore. He had seen the wound she kept striking. While the family drifted through their silent storm, Robert found something he hadn't. He felt in years breathing room. Without the emotional pull of disappointment, he discovered peaceful routines, long evening walks, quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons spent tending to the small garden he'd neglected for too long. The loneliness was real, but so was the relief. He began accepting, finally, that he might never have a meaningful relationship with Charlotte again. And oddly, that acceptance gave him strength. But for Charlotte, the realization hit much harder. One night, alone in her immaculate living room, she reread Robert's letter. Not with anger this time, not with defensiveness or wounded pride, but with a clarity she had tried to avoid. She traced the lines with her fingertips, absorbing each quiet truth he had laid bare. Only then did the weight of her actions settle fully onto her chest. She saw, with a sharpness that made her stomach twist, that she had pushed her father away not by accident, but by pattern, and that he had finally stopped reaching for her. The silence between them was no longer a temporary pause. It was a verdict. And Robert, settling into the calm he had carved out for himself, no longer felt compelled to close the gap. He wasn't angry. He was done. Guilt had a way of creeping into Charlotte's life at the quietest moments. It surfaced in the pauses between conversations, in the silence after her laughter faded, in the stillness of nights when she lay awake staring at the ceiling. She kept replaying the memory of Robert standing in the doorway, distant, unreadable, already halfway gone. She tried, awkwardly, clumsily, to fix things. She sent longer messages, voice notes filled with strained warmth, small tokens of affection that once might have meant something. But every attempt bounced against the cold wall Robert had built between them. His replies were brief, polite, empty. Sometimes he didn't reply at all. Each silence felt heavier than the last. Jard saw the strain in both of them and felt a responsibility to bridge the gap. One afternoon after work, he drove to Robert's house unannounced. Robert was in the yard trimming branches, his movements slow and deliberate. Jard approached cautiously, hands shoved in his pockets. "Robert," he began, "I know things are tense, but is there any way, any path to fixing this?" Robert didn't stop working. "Not while she thinks this is about a single incident," he said quietly. "This is years of being unseen." Jard swallowed. "She's trying maybe in the wrong ways, but she is." "I don't want gestures," Robert said. "I want understanding, and she's never been willing to give that." There was no anger in his voice, just a resigned firmness that left Jard with nothing more to argue. He nodded helplessly and left, realizing the situation wasn't something he could mediate anymore. Inside her own home, Sarah felt a different kind of fear tightening around her. She watched Robert retreat into himself, watched him grow quieter, more self-contained, as if each passing day allowed him to detach another thread tying him to Charlotte. Sarah loved them both, and the distance between them felt like standing at the edge of a cliff watching the ground crumble. She called Charlotte one evening, urging her to try one last time, to stop waiting for Robert to soften. But Charlotte's pride rose like a reflexive shield. "He won't even listen," she insisted. "Why should I keep humiliating myself?" "It's not humiliation," Sarah said softly. "It's love." Charlotte didn't answer. Love had never felt so complicated. Meanwhile, David continued weaving his subtle interference, though the effect was beginning to weaken. Over dinner one night, he remarked, "You shouldn't have to beg for your father's attention. If he can't appreciate what you offer, that's his failing, not yours." But instead of soothing her anger, the comment irritated her. She heard something hollow in his tone, an echo of dismissal that suddenly felt all too familiar. For the first time, David's influence didn't strengthen her position. It made her feel small, manipulated, pushed in a direction she didn't want to go. She realized he wasn't helping. He never had been. During this time, Robert found himself retreating further, not out of spite but out of necessity. He spent more time outdoors, walking through quiet neighborhoods or sitting on park benches watching children play. The distance gave him space to think, to reflect on the life he had built and the parts of it he'd neglected. He remembered the early years with Charlotte, the bedtime stories, the weekend hikes, the countless small sacrifices he'd made without expecting anything in return. And now, looking back, he wondered if she had ever truly seen him as anything other than a stepping stone to better places. Those thoughts hardened into resolve. One evening, Charlotte finally broke. She drove to Robert's house, her emotions raw and her patience gone. She didn't call ahead. She walked straight up to the door and no. She said hard enough that Sarah hurried from the kitchen to answer. "Is he here?" Charlotte asked, breath tight. Sarah hesitated but stepped aside. "He's in the living room." Robert didn't stand when Charlotte entered. He set aside the book he was reading and looked up with the calm of someone who had nothing left to lose. "We need to talk," Charlotte said sharply. "Then talk," Robert replied. The confrontation unfolded like a slow, unraveling thread. Charlotte demanded to know why he had shut her out so completely, why he couldn't accept her apology, why he insisted on dragging the pain forward. Robert answered each question with a steady, unsettling honesty. He spoke of years of feeling invisible, of moments she dismissed without even realizing, of wounds reopened each time she chose convenience over connection. He wasn't angry, just tired. So tired. Charlotte's defensiveness cracked under the weight of his words, but instead of pulling them closer, the truth pushed them further apart. She realized how deep the damage truly ran, how long she had been blind to it. When she finally left the house, there was no shouting, no dramatic exit, just a quiet collapse of hope neither of them knew how to rebuild. Inside, Robert exhaled shakily, drained by the conversation. The divide had not closed. It had widened. Charlotte felt the stalemate settling over her life like a thick fog. Days passed without a word from Robert, each one heavier than the last. She convinced herself that she had one more chance, one last gesture that might soften him, might remind him of the bond they once had. So she chose a gift carefully, something she believed carried meaning. A beautiful watch with a polished silver band, engraved with the words "to the first man I ever loved." It was expensive, elegant, sentimental, or at least it looked sentimental from a distance. She wrapped it herself, hands trembling, and sent it with a handwritten note she rewrote 3 times before settling on something safe, something that didn't expose too much regret. When the package left her hands, she let out a shaky breath, hoping it would reach the version of her father who used to smile just at the sound of her voice. When Robert found the package on his doorstep that evening, he brought it inside with the same quiet routine that had shaped his days since the fallout. He sat at the dining table, opened the box, and stared at the watch for a long moment. It was undeniably beautiful, the kind of gift meant to impress, to shine, to distract. But it didn't move him. He placed it on his wrist, testing the weight, studying the gleam, waiting for some spark of emotion to surface. Anger, nostalgia, a flicker of warmth. Nothing came. The watch felt like every other gift she had sent, polished, expensive, hollow. A gesture meant to fill the void without actually addressing the wound beneath it. He slipped it off, set it back in the box, and pushed it aside without ceremony. Later that evening, the tension finally cracked inside Jarred. He found Charlotte pacing their living room, checking her phone every few minutes, hoping for a message that wasn't coming. "He didn't respond," she muttered, "not even a thank you." Jarred exhaled sharply. "Because you're not hearing him, Charlotte. You keep sending things instead of actually apologizing." "I did apologize." "You apologized so he'd stop being angry," Jarred shot back. "Not because you finally understood why he was." Charlotte froze, stunned by his tone. Jarred rarely raised his voice. But tonight he was tired, tired of navigating two wounded people, tired of watching Charlotte use material comfort to patch over emotional fractures. "You can't buy your way out of this," he said, softer now but still firm. "You can't gift-wrap healing." Charlotte felt the sting of his words but couldn't find a rebuttal. She looked away, her eyes burning with something she didn't yet know how to name. Meanwhile, across town, David's patience began to unravel. He had expected Charlotte's wealth, her charm, her position beside him to be enough to sway Robert eventually. But nothing worked. Robert remained unmovable, untouched by David's subtle belittling, unimpressed by his displays of status. "So he rejects the watch too," David snapped when Charlotte told him. "Your father is impossible." Charlotte didn't answer. She saw something cold in David's frustration, an irritation that had nothing to do with her pain and everything to do with his ego. His anger was not sympathy. It was annoyance that his influence wasn't enough. And for the first time, she wondered if she had spent too many years listening to the wrong man. As the night deepened, a quiet realization began to settle in her chest. Maybe Robert would never be the father she'd imagined, the one who forgave easily, who absorbed every blow and came back smiling. And maybe she wasn't the daughter he needed. Maybe she had never been willing to meet him where he stood. The guilt rose slowly but sharply, a weight pressing against her ribs. She could no longer deny her role in the distance growing between them. While Charlotte wrestled with regret, Robert sat alone in the dim living room, illuminated only by the soft glow of a table lamp. He looked at the watch once more, ran a thumb along its polished edge, and quietly closed the lid. The gesture felt final somehow, not cruel, just decisive. He no longer felt the tug that used to pull him back toward reconciliation. He no longer waited for her to understand him, or for himself to be understood. He felt free. In that stillness, he realized he didn't need the relationship to be repaired to move forward. He didn't need closure, apologies, or promises. He had spent too many years bending under the weight of expectations, hoping Charlotte would eventually see him. Now he saw himself clearly, his worth no longer tied to her approval. He stood, walked to the porch, and stepped into the cool night air. A small, steady shift took place inside him, a release he hadn't expected but fully embraced. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace, with or without her. And as he looked out at the quiet street, he knew the story wasn't over. But whatever came next would happen on his terms. Charlotte had never known silence like this. Her home, a sleek, polished mansion filled with marble floors, designer furniture, and the subtle hum of climate control, had always felt impressive, enviable, a symbol of the life she believed she wanted. But now every corner echoed with a hollowness she couldn't escape. She wandered from room to room, unable to settle, unable to shake the sense that she was surrounded by everything except what mattered. The rift with her father weighed on her like a constant pressure against her ribs. Each day without his voice, without even a curt response, carved the isolation deeper. Her phone remained stubbornly quiet. She found herself replaying old memories, ones she hadn't thought of in years. Her father taking her to school in their beat-up truck. His laughter when she brought home a crooked craft project. His excitement the day she got accepted into college. And the slow shift that followed, the drifting, the distance she'd never bothered to address until it was too late. Jard noticed the change long before she admitted it. At first, he tried to comfort her, offering gentle reassurances, suggesting she give Robert more time. But as the weeks passed, he started noticing cracks beneath Charlotte's polished exterior, moments where her frustration turned inward, where her defensiveness melted into confusion, then regret. He watched her clutch her phone as if waiting for it to ring, watched her stare at old photos on her laptop, watched the guilt settle into her posture. He also began questioning himself. Had he enabled her dismissiveness toward Robert? Had he encouraged her reliance on material fixes because it made life easier? Had he been too passive in moments when he should have intervened? The questions gnawed at him silently. Meanwhile, David sensed his grip on Charlotte weakening. Gone was the proud confidence she typically displayed around him. Instead, she sat at his table one afternoon picking at her food, distracted and withdrawn. Irritated, he offered advice wrapped in condescension. "You're overthinking all this," he said, swirling a glass of wine. "Your father is stubborn, let it go. He'll come around eventually." Charlotte looked up, eyes tired. "It's not about him coming around." David raised an eyebrow. "Then what is it about?" She hesitated, surprising even herself when she answered. "About me, about what I've done." David waved off the comment with a dismissive chuckle, but Charlotte felt a shift, subtle, quiet, but unmistakable. His reassurance didn't comfort her this time. It irritated her. His indifference felt tone-deaf, hollow, out of step with the weight she carried. For the first time, she saw how quick he was to push away responsibility, how easy it was for him to expect others to adapt instead of changing himself. And suddenly, she understood how deeply she had absorbed that mindset. While Charlotte wrestled with uncomfortable truths, Robert slipped into a quieter, more content rhythm. The emotional storm had passed for him, not because things were fixed, but because he had finally stopped trying to fix them. He spent his mornings in the garden pulling weeds and planting herbs. Afternoons were reserved for long drives into nearby towns, the kind he used to promise himself he'd take when things calmed down. Evenings were spent reading books he had abandoned halfway through years ago. His life felt lighter, defined by small pleasures instead of old wounds. He no longer checked his phone expecting a message. He no longer braced for disappointment. The quiet he once feared had become a companion. But for Sarah, the silence brought no peace. She stood in the middle of a widening emotional canyon, one daughter on one side, her husband on the other, and no bridge strong enough to connect them. She watched Robert embrace his independence, watched him smile more often now, watched him rediscover himself in ways she admired but also feared. Because with each step he took toward healing alone, she felt him drift further from the idea of reconciliation. Had she done enough to stop this? Had she stepped aside too often? Had she enabled the distance without meaning to? The questions pressed on her with painful persistence. Charlotte, meanwhile, reached her breaking point quietly one night. She sat on the floor beside her bed, legs pulled close, the engraved watch she'd given Robert clutched in her hands. She had imagined the gift would unlock something in him, nostalgia, affection, anything. Instead, it had forced her to confront a truth she had long resisted. She could not fix their relationship with things. She could not expect him to bend when she had never learned to. Tears she didn't expect slipped down her cheeks. She wasn't crying for his silence. She was crying for the years she had spent refusing to understand him. And in that moment, she realized something her pride had shielded her from. She might never get the apology she once demanded. And maybe, painfully, she did not deserve it. Across town, Robert finished watering the garden and sat down on the porch steps. The sunset washed the yard in shades of gold and rose. He breathed deeply, letting the quiet settle around him. The solitude didn't feel like loneliness anymore. It felt like acceptance. It happened quietly, no dramatic phone call, no unexpected visit, no confrontation at the doorstep. One morning, several months after the silence had carved itself deep into their lives, Robert opened his mailbox and found an envelope in Charlotte's handwriting. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. The sight stirred something distant in him, recognition mixed with caution, memory mixed with fatigue. He carried it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened it with deliberate care. The letter inside was longer than he expected, written in her unsteady script. She didn't dress her words in excuses this time. She wrote plainly, almost painfully, about her selfishness, her arrogance, the ways she had dismissed him. She described the nights she couldn't sleep, the moments she replayed the pain she caused, the guilt she didn't know how to manage. She wrote, "I didn't want to admit I hurt you because admitting it meant admitting the kind of person I've been." And at the end, she wrote one final line. "I'm sorry, Dad. Not for the argument, not for the gifts, but for all the years I didn't see you." Robert sat back in his chair, the letter trembling slightly between his fingers. He wasn't expecting this. Not the vulnerability, not the honesty, not the tone that felt more like the daughter he once knew than the woman who had drifted far from him. But the truth was complicated. Moving didn't erase the bruise. The apology didn't erase the years. He set the letter down gently and didn't pick it up again for the rest of the day. Robert spent the following week in a careful, uneasy contemplation. He walked, gardened, read, his usual routines, but something was different. The letter had stirred the sediment of old wounds, reminding him that healing didn't always stay neatly in place. He could respond. He could stay silent. Both choices carried weight. He wasn't sure which one he could live with. Then Jard called. There was a hesitance in his voice that Robert had never heard before. "Robert, I owe you an apology." Robert blinked, taken aback. "For what?" "For standing by when I shouldn't have," Jard said. "For letting Charlotte fall into habits that hurt you. I should have spoken up years ago. You didn't deserve the way things unfolded." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. It didn't fix anything, but it softened something in Robert's chest, a small easing of tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I appreciate that," Robert said quietly, "more than you know." Jard exhaled, relieved. "If you ever want to talk, or if you ever want to come by, you're always welcome. No expectations." Robert thanked him, but the caution remained. Because forgiveness was never the issue, rebuilding was. But not everyone welcomed the shift. Whoa! RD of the letter and Robert's hesitant silence reached David through Charlotte's strained conversations. And David, sensing that the emotional distance he relied on was beginning to close, immediately tried to reassert his influence. At a family gathering, he cornered Robert with a calculated smile. "I hear Charlotte reached out. Good. She's finally realizing where her loyalties should lie." Robert stiffened. "She doesn't owe her loyalty to anyone, especially not out of guilt." David chuckled, low and dismissive. "You're still too soft. If you keep holding onto this moral high ground, you'll lose her again." Robert met his eyes, and for the first time in years, he saw David clearly, not as the rival he once imagined, but as the catalyst for many of the fractures between him and his daughter. "I didn't lose her because I wasn't enough," he said quietly. "I lost her because she believed people like you were more worthy of her time." David's smile faltered. "And now," Robert continued, "I won't let you dictate what happens next." With that, Robert walked away, leaving David simmering in an anger he couldn't disguise as concern. Meanwhile, Charlotte was undergoing her own reckoning. The letter she had written had taken more from her than she expected. It had forced her to peel back layers of excuses and confront the truth about herself. She started therapy, not because someone told her to, but because she needed help untangling the habits and defenses she'd carried for so long. She began to understand that repairing what she broke wasn't about earning forgiveness. It was about becoming someone worthy of it. Weeks passed, and Robert continued to feel the weight of indecision. He was open to the idea of healing. He wasn't a man who cherished resentment, but allowing her back into his life felt like inviting old wounds to reopen. He didn't know if he was strong enough for that kind of vulnerability again. But one quiet evening, after rereading the letter for the third time, Robert made his choice. He picked up his phone, stared at her name for a long moment, and finally typed, "We can talk, but slowly, one step at a time." He didn't know what their future would look like, or if it would last. But he was willing to try. Not fully, not blindly. Just halfway. The park wasn't crowded that morning. A light breeze carried the scent of damp grass, and the sun was just beginning to warm the tops of the trees. Robert chose a bench near the walking trail, a quiet space far from joggers and families. He didn't want noise. He didn't want distraction. If this meeting was going to happen, it needed space, real space. Charlotte arrived 5 minutes late, her steps slow, cautious, as if the ground beneath her were unfamiliar. She spotted him immediately, her posture tightening before softening again. The months apart had aged something in her, not physically, but in the eyes, in the way she carried her breath. She approached with a hesitant smile that didn't quite reach her face. "Hi, Dad," she said, voice low. Robert nodded. "Charlotte." For a moment, neither spoke. They sat shoulder to shoulder, a few feet apart, the silence thick but not hostile, just awkward, as if the vocabulary between them had to be rebuilt from scratch. Charlotte commented on the weather first, a small, nervous attempt at normalcy. Robert offered a polite reply. They discussed the birds nearby, the renovations happening in town, a new cafe Sarah liked. Surface-level words, gentle and restrained, circling the real conversation waiting underneath. Eventually, Charlotte exhaled deeply, her hands tightening in her lap. "Dad, I know small talk isn't why we're here." Robert remained still, his gaze fixed on the pond ahead. "No, it is." She swallowed hard. "I've been in therapy for months. My therapist told me I needed to stop rehearsing excuses and start facing the truth." Her voice trembled slightly. "And the truth is I hurt you, over and over. I treated you like you didn't matter. I thought you'd always bend, always forgive, always take whatever I gave you." He didn't interrupt. He didn't rescue her from her own confession. "I was selfish," she continued, "and careless, and blind to what you sacrificed for me. You didn't deserve the way I talked to you or the way I ignored you." She blinked quickly, holding back tears. "I'm sorry, Dad, not just for the bus ticket, for everything." Robert finally turned to her. Her expression wasn't performative this time. There was no defensiveness, no shield of pride, just a raw sincerity he hadn't seen in years. It softened something in him, though not enough to erase all the pain at once. "I hear you," he said quietly, "and I can tell you mean it." Her breath caught, relief mixed with fear. "But," he added gently, "that doesn't make everything disappear." She nodded, accepting the boundary before he even stated it. Across the park, Jard stood near a tree, giving them space while keeping a watchful eye. He hadn't wanted to int rude, but he understood the weight of this moment. He'd seen Charlotte's growth, seen her wrestle with her demons, seen her try, truly try, to understand the damage she caused. Yet he also understood that Robert's forgiveness wasn't owed. It had to be earned slowly with consistency. When Robert glanced over briefly, Jard gave him a small nod, not pushing, not pleading, just offering quiet support. One person notably missing from the scene was David. His absence wasn't just physical, it symbolized something greater. For years, he had hovered like a shadow over Charlotte's decisions, nudging her pride, feeding her ego, shaping the distance between her and her father. But today, for the first time in a long time, Charlotte faced Robert without David's influence whispering in her ear. It was just father and daughter. No wealth, no hierarchy, no expectations. Charlotte wiped her cheek and steadied her voice. "Dad, I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or trust me. I want a chance to rebuild things, slowly, whatever pace you need." Robert took a long breath. This was the crossroad he'd feared, the moment where choice became unavoidable. He didn't hate her. He didn't wish her pain, but he also couldn't pretend nothing had happened. Too much had been said. Too much had been broken. "I'm willing to move forward," he finally said, "but not back to where we were. We'll have boundaries. We'll take it slow. And you'll need to show consistently that this isn't just another phase." "I will," she promised immediately, almost too quickly, but the determination in her voice was real. He nodded, "Then we'll try." The words weren't warm, but they weren't cold either. They lived in that middle space, fragile, tentative, hopeful. They stayed on the bench for another hour, talking more openly than they had in years. There were still long pauses, still moments of emotional distance, but underneath it all was a sense of movement, small, cautious, but forward. When they finally stood to leave, Charlotte lingered. "Dad, thank you, really." Robert offered a faint, tired smile. "It's a start." As he walked away, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not forgiveness, not comfort, but the faintest stirring of possibility. The path ahead was long, uneven, uncertain. But for the first time, it felt like a path worth trying to walk. Rebuilding came quietly, not with dramatic breakthroughs or sudden warmth, but with small, deliberate moments that slowly stitched the torn edges back together. Robert and Charlotte agreed to meet once a week, usually at a small cafe near the park where their first conversation had taken place. Their meetings were cautious at first. They talked about surface-level topics: work, the weather, Sarah's garden, local news. But gradually, as the weeks turned into months, the conversations deepened. They didn't revisit the past all at once. Instead, they gently worked their way toward it, the way someone approaches a bruise, carefully, aware of where it still hurts. One morning, over warm mugs of coffee, Charlotte asked softly, "Do you think there's a version of us that can feel normal again?" Robert took a long moment before answering. "Maybe not the old normal," he said, "but something new, something honest." It wasn't a promise, but it was something. Jard remained a quiet presence throughout the rebuilding. He no longer forced conversations or tried to mediate every misunderstanding. Instead, he listened, observed, and offered steady encouragement to both sides without pushing them toward reconciliation faster than they were ready for. When Robert needed space, Jard respected it. When Charlotte needed someone to talk to after a difficult conversation with her father, he listened without judgment. His role wasn't to fix anything now. It was simply to hold steady ground while the two people he cared for learned how to navigate each other again. For the first time in nearly a year, Robert allowed himself to attend family gatherings, small ones at first, a Sunday dinner, a backyard barbecue, a birthday celebration for one of the younger cousins. He never stayed too long, and he never placed himself at the center of things. He remained slightly withdrawn, careful with his words, cautious with his presence. But he was there, and that alone meant more to Charlotte than she could express. She worked hard, harder than she ever had, to show that she valued him. She asked about his days, actually listened when he answered, invited him to small outings rather than large events where she knew he'd feel overshadowed. She offered help without assuming he needed it, gave space when he looked overwhelmed, and tried to express appreciation without overstepping into guilt or desperation. David, who once stood like a giant shadow between them, began to fade naturally from the dynamic. Charlotte no longer ran to him for validation. She stopped seeking his approval on every decision. And when he attempted his usual TLE jabs toward Robert during gatherings, Charlotte didn't laugh or defend them. Sometimes she ignored him outright, other times she excused herself from the room. David noticed the shift, though he rarely confronted it. Instead, he gradually receded, his influence weakening simply because Charlotte no longer needed it to feel secure. To Sarah, all of this felt like watching a long-dormant garden finally sprout. She kept a careful distance, not wanting to interfere or accelerate the process, but she felt hope returning in cautious waves. She saw the effort Charlotte put in, the gradual softening in Robert, the restoration of small rituals that once defined their family. For the first time in a long time, she felt peace settling into the spaces that had once held fear. But healing wasn't linear. Charlotte still struggled with her own patterns, old habits of defensiveness, sudden bursts of shame, moments where she felt the urge to run from accountability rather than sit in its discomfort. Some meetings with Robert ended with her crying alone in her car afterward, overwhelmed by the realization of how much work she still had to do. Other times she felt buoyed by the progress they made, hopeful in a way she didn't dare express. Through all of it, she stayed committed, even when it was painful, even when Robert didn't meet her effort with equal warmth. She understood now that this wasn't about quick fixes or grand gestures. It was about consistency, humility, and the willingness to keep showing up. And Robert slowly began to accept that truth. One quiet evening, while reading at his kitchen table, he paused mid-sentence and realized something had shifted. The resentment that once felt like a permanent weight had lightened. He still remembered the pain, the disappointment, the years of feeling invisible, but the memories no longer controlled him. Charlotte's apology, her efforts, her sincerity, they had begun to soften the hard edges. He set the book down and closed his eyes. He wasn't forgetting, he wasn't erasing the past. But he was ready, finally, to accept her apology not as an erasure of what happened, but as the foundation of something new. A new chapter, a fragile one, but a real one. And that, he realized, was enough. Charlotte made a promise to herself, quietly, privately, that she would no longer let convenience guide the relationship she had with her father. And for the first time in her adult life, she honored that promise. She carved space in her schedule, not out of obligation, but out of genuine intent. She visited Robert without the shield of gifts or rehearsed apologies. She listened, really listened, when he talked, even when the truths were uncomfortable. She asked questions she had avoided for years. She paid attention to his expressions, his pauses, the subtle shifts in his tone. And slowly, she began piecing together the father she had overlooked for so long. Robert didn't make the process easy. He offered polite conversation at first, then cautious engagement. He didn't rush to fill silence or smooth awkward moments, and Charlotte didn't try to force them away. She simply sat with him on park benches, at kitchen tables, during slow walks around the neighborhood, letting the rhythm of something new take shape between them. It wasn't warmth yet, but it wasn't coldness either. It was rebuilding, brick by brick, word by word. Jard stood quietly by, more supportive than ever. He had learned to avoid interfering, but he made sure both of them knew he was rooting for them. When Charlotte came home discouraged after a difficult conversation, he reminded her, progress isn't always visible. Sometimes it's just not losing ground. When Robert hesitated to accept an invitation, Jard gently encouraged him to give Charlotte the benefit of time. He became a steadying force, neutral, patient, hopeful. The shift became clear during one particular coffee meeting. It was raining lightly outside, tapping softly against the cafe window. Charlotte stirred her drink absent-mindedly while Robert watched the rain, his shoulders relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in years. "Dad," she said softly, "can I ask you something?" He looked at her, waiting. "When did you start feeling like you were losing me?" The question landed between them with surprising weight. Robert didn't answer immediately. He set his cup down, leaned back, and let out a long, slow breath. "A long time ago," he said finally. "Before the bus ticket, before the gifts, it was the small things, the calls you stopped returning, the holidays you left early, the way you'd light up when David entered a room but barely looked my way." His voice didn't crack, but the pain beneath it was unmistakable. "I kept telling myself it was normal, that children grow up and drift, but it wasn't the drifting that hurt. It was the indifference." Charlotte lowered her gaze, blinking back tears. "I didn't see it," she whispered. "I didn't want to see it. I was so busy proving myself to everyone else that I forgot the one person who never asked me to." There was no bitterness in Robert's response. "I know," he said simply. For the first time in years, they talked without the sharp edges of anger, without defensiveness. They discussed childhood memories, the times they had misunderstood each other, the mistakes they'd both made. Pain surfaced, but instead of widening the distance, it cleared some of the fog that had clouded them for so long. Through all of this, David's name never came up, not because they avoided it, but because he no longer mattered in the space they were rebuilding. His influence had evaporated naturally, pushed out by the more honest foundation forming between father and daughter. The absence was noticeable, even liberating. Robert didn't feel the old bitterness, and Charlotte didn't feel the need to defend him. It was as if the shadow that once hung over their relationship had finally lifted. One evening after a simple shared dinner, Robert stepped outside and watched Charlotte walk toward her car. She paused before opening the door and looked back at him, offering a small, hopeful smile. And for the first time, he didn't question it. He didn't wonder if it was forced or temporary. He simply felt the sincerity behind it. Later that night, sitting alone in his favorite armchair, Robert reflected on the distance that had once felt impossible to cross. It wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but it was narrowing. The conversations, the effort, the vulnerability, all of it pointed to something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: possibility. Charlotte was changing, not perfectly, not quickly, but genuinely. She asked instead of assumed. She apologized without expecting anything in return. She showed up because she wanted to, not because she felt she had to. Her growth was steady and real. And Robert, despite the scars still tender beneath the surface, felt himself opening, just a little, to the idea of hope. Not blind hope, not naive forgiveness, but a cautious belief that maybe, just maybe, their relationship wasn't destroyed. Maybe it was becoming something new. And as he turned off the lamp, letting the room settle into quiet shadows, he admitted something he never thought he would again. He believed their bond could be repaired. Not today, not tomorrow, but one patient, deliberate step at a time. The test came without warning. A paperwork error in the family business. An old rental property Robert still co-owned with Charlotte suddenly threatened to derail a long-standing tenant agreement. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was messy, time-sensitive, and required cooperation between father and daughter. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. After months of careful, delicate healing, they were being forced into a situation that demanded trust, clarity, and emotional composure. Three things they had struggled with for years. Charlotte was the first to call. "Dad, we have a problem," she said, voice steady but tight. She explained the misfiled documents, the looming deadline, the possibility of legal trouble if they didn't act quickly. For the first time since their reconciliation, she didn't sound defensive or dismissive, just straightforward, responsible, present. Robert listened silently, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Working with her again on anything felt like stepping onto a bridge still under construction. But the issue was real, and avoiding it wasn't an option. "All right," he said finally. "Let's talk in person." Jard joined them that afternoon at the property office. He wasn't there to take sides. He positioned himself carefully between them, a steadying presence as old tension crackled faintly beneath the surface. He laid out the documents, clarified the deadlines, and explained what needed to be done. His tone stayed neutral, his movements calm, almost diplomatic. Charlotte took the lead, surprising Robert with her preparedness. She had already drafted a corrective plan, highlighted key dates, and arranged a meeting with the tenant. She spoke with a confidence he hadn't seen from her, one grounded not in arrogance but competence. But as they reviewed the documents together, old patterns resurfaced like ghosts lingering just beneath the floorboards. Robert interrupted her explanations a few times, his caution slipping into suspicion. Charlotte bristled more than once, old defensiveness clawing at the edges of her voice. At one point, she inhaled sharply, ready to snap, but Jard gently touched her arm, a reminder, a cue. She recalibrated. "No," she said softly, "let me try that again." Her restraint didn't go unnoticed. Still, Robert struggled. He found himself questioning her intentions, wondering whether she truly cared about the work or just wanted to prove a point. The fear of slipping back into old hurts lingered like a warning in the back of his mind. He didn't want to be blindsided again. He didn't want to trust too quickly. But Charlotte S.H. owed no signs of her former self. She didn't rush him. She didn't mock his concerns. She didn't shove solutions down his throat. Instead, she paused whenever he hesitated and asked, "What do you think?" Words she had rarely used with him before. "Are you sure this is the right approach?" Robert questioned at one point, eyeing the paperwork. Charlotte nodded. "I've double-checked everything, but if you see something I missed, tell me. I want us to be on the same page." Jard watched the exchange with quiet relief. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even smooth, but it was progress, honest progress. And then came the moment that changed everything. After hours of reviewing, adjusting, and planning, they reached an impasse about the final step. It was a decision that would impact the tenant directly and required delicate handling. Charlotte presented her recommendation, outlining every detail with clarity. She waited for Robert to approve or challenge her. He felt that familiar tug of doubt, habitual, instinctive, but something in her expression stopped him. There was no entitlement there. No expectation that he would concede simply because she was louder or more confident. Instead, there was openness, vulnerability, respect. For the first time in a long time, Robert didn't feel overshadowed. He exhaled slowly. "All right," he said, "let's do it your way." Charlotte blinked in surprise. "Really?" "Yes," he said. "You've done the work. I trust your judgment on this." The words weren't dramatic, but to Charlotte, they landed with the weight of a bridge finally meeting in the middle. Jard glanced between them, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The meeting with the tenant went smoothly. Charlotte handled the explanation with grace, Robert backed her when needed, and the issue was resolved far more easily than any of them had expected. As they walked out of the building, the late afternoon sun spilled across the parking lot, warm and quiet. Robert paused beside his truck, looking at Charlotte with a mixture of surprise and pride. "You did well today," he said. It wasn't extravagant praise, but for Charlotte it was everything. "Thank you," she whispered, genuinely moved. And as they parted ways, Robert felt something subtle shift inside him, a loosening of the fear, a softening of the rigid walls he had built. It wasn't full healing, but it was a significant step, toward believing that the future they were working toward might actually exist. The crisis came crashing into the family without warning, sudden, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Sarah collapsed during a routine grocery trip, her vision blurring before her legs gave out. The fall wasn't dramatic, but the aftermath was. She was rushed to the hospital, unconscious and unresponsive, sending shockwaves through every branch of the family. Robert arrived first, breath uneven, hands trembling as he gripped the railings outside the emergency room. Charlotte and Jard arrived minutes later, stumbling into the hallway with fear written plainly on their faces. For Robert and Charlotte, the timing was cruel. They had only just begun to rebuild, to rediscover how to be father and daughter. Now, the fragile bridge between them was being tested by something far bigger than old hurt. Doctors explained the situation quickly. Sarah would need immediate evaluation, maybe surgery, maybe a prolonged stay. The uncertainty hollowed the room. Robert felt the old instinct rising in him, that desperate need to protect his family, but layered over it was a quieter fear. What if this crisis shattered the delicate healing he and Charlotte had worked so hard to build? But the true test revealed itself when decisions needed to be made, about Sarah's care, finances, preferences, long-term implications. Choices that affected everyone, choices that would expose the fault lines between them. And that's when David inserted himself. He arrived at the hospital with an air of authority he had no right to carry, acting as if Sarah were his responsibility too. He spoke over Robert, questioned the doctors aggressively, and announced opinions no one had asked him for. Charlotte hovered uneasily between the two men, torn between the father she was rebuilding and the father-in-law who had shaped her for years. "Charlotte," David said sharply, pulling her aside, "you need to support your husband's family here. Robert is too emotional to make decisions." Robert heard the comment from down the hall. The words weren't shouted, but they cut through him like a blade. He didn't react, not outwardly, but something deep inside him recoiled. It felt like the past all over again. David positioning himself above him, undermining him, treating him like he was insignificant. Jard stood awkwardly nearby, his expression conflicted. He wanted to support Robert, he truly did, yet he also felt the pressure of his own family's expectations. Torn in half, he said nothing, which only made the silence heavier. "Charles." Ott looked between them, her father, pale and shaken, trying to hold himself together, and David, composed, dismissive, urging her to stand with him. It was the exact crossroads she had avoided for years. But not this time. She stepped away from David. "Dad," she said softly, walking toward Robert, "what do you need from me?" It was just 8 words, quiet, simple, but they shifted the air instantly. David stiffened. "Charlotte," he snapped, "don't be dramatic. This isn't the time for emotional loyalty tests." She turned to him, eyes calm but resolute. "It's not a test, it's clarity. My mother is in there, my father is out here, and I stand with my family." David looked stunned, truly stunned, as if the ground had moved under his feet. He opened his mouth to argue, but Charlotte cut him off, her tone firm in a way he had never heard from her before. "Please leave," she said. "You're making this harder." David's face hardened. "You're choosing wrong," he hissed. "No," she answered, "I'm choosing right." And with that, the last thread of influence he had over her snapped. Jard finally spoke, stepping to Charlotte's side. "I support her," he said quietly, "and Robert, I'm here for you too." The shift was complete. Hours later, after tests and consultations, the crisis began to settle. Sarah regained consciousness, weak but stable. The doctors explained that with rest, careful monitoring, and follow-ups, she would recover. Relief washed through the hallway like a warm tide. Robert leaned against the wall, exhaling a breath he felt he'd been holding for years. Charlotte approached him slowly, her eyes red, her hands trembling not with fear but with emotion. "Dad," she whispered, I meant what I said. I'm here for you, for Mom, for us. I'm done letting other people steer me." Robert looked at her, truly looked at her, past the mistakes, past the hurt, past the years of distance. What he saw was not the careless daughter who once handed him a bus ticket, but a woman who had faced herself, dismantled her pride, and chosen him when it mattered most. He nodded, voice quiet. "Thank you, Charlotte." They stood side by side at Sarah's bedside later that night, the quiet hum of hospital machines filling the silence. Charlotte rested her hand on her mother's, and Robert rested his beside hers. No grand gestures, no dramatic speeches, just presence, steady, united healing. When they stepped out into the hallway, Robert turned to her. "I forgive you," he said, "not because everything is fixed, but because you've shown me you want it to be." Charlotte's breath hitched. "I do, more than anything." Robert pulled her into a careful, tentative hug, the first in years. And for the first time he believed it. They had a new beginning. Not perfect, not complete, but real. Rebuilding trust didn't come in grand gestures or sudden breakthroughs. It came in quiet, steady steps that slowly reshaped the rhythm between Robert and Charlotte. After Sarah was released from the hospital and the crisis eased, father and daughter found themselves drawn into smaller, more personal projects together. Charlotte helped Robert repaint the old shed behind his house, a task they once did together when she was 12. Robert assisted Charlotte with organizing old family photos she wanted to digitize, something she had put off for years. These were modest tasks, almost mundane, but they stitched moments of shared purpose back into their lives. The awkwardness was still there, the hesitation still noticeable, yet each small collaboration softened a little more of the distance that had once felt insurmountable. Jard, watching this unfold, felt his understanding shift as well. He had always believed he was neutral, the calm mediator, but neutrality had often made him passive. One evening, while helping Robert carry tools back to the garage, he paused, shifting uncomfortably. "Robert," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, a real one. Not just for the things I didn't say, but for not seeing what you were going through. I should have stepped in years ago." Robert looked at him, surprised by the sincerity. Jard wasn't making excuses, he was taking responsibility. "We all miss things," Robert answered gently. "What matters is we're trying now." But Jard shook his head, determined. "You deserved better than silence." Robert gave a small nod. The apology didn't erase the past, but it widened the space for honest connection between them, something long overdue. Charlotte, meanwhile, was doing her own inner work. Therapy became a weekly appointment she didn't skip, a place where she unraveled her guilt, her defenses, the memories she had pushed aside for years. She spoke about her longing to impress David, her fear of disappointing him, the way she had used his approval as a shield against her insecurities. She talked about Robert, too, how she had felt torn between two father figures, how she had mistaken criticism for guidance, wealth for wisdom, distance for independence. She admitted that somewhere along the way, she had stopped being her own person. And for the first time, she acknowledged that her emotional distance from Robert wasn't just neglect. It was avoidance born from her own unresolved confusion. On the other side of this healing, Robert was doing work he never imagined he needed. Therapy was not a place he ever expected to find himself, yet his sessions brought truths he could no longer ignore. He confronted the pride that had hardened him, the emotional distance he had built long before Charlotte ever drifted. He saw how his silence had sometimes been a wall, not a shield. And he recognized that part of their fractured relationship came from years in which he didn't reach for her either, not out of anger, but fear of being dismissed. Through this quiet parallel healing, father and daughter discovered something they had both forgotten. Neither of them had been the villain. Both had been hurt. Both had contributed to the cracks, and both were choosing to mend them, one steady step at a time. David, however, sensed the shift. He felt Charlotte slipping from the orbit he once controlled so easily. His comments became sharper, disguised as humor. "I see you and your dad are inseparable these days," or laced with subtle resentment. "Careful, Charlotte, don't forget who helped you get where you are." But his attempts no longer landed the way they once had. Charlotte didn't argue, she simply stopped engaging. And without her validation, his influence diminished like a fire finally running out of oxygen. Robert didn't celebrate David's fading presence. He simply welcomed the peace that filled the space once clouded by tension. For Sarah, watching her family so slowly and carefully reassemble felt like witnessing the first light after a storm. She noticed the way Robert's shoulders relaxed when Charlotte entered a room, the way Charlotte's voice softened when she spoke to him, the way Jard stepped in not to mediate but to support. She saw effort where there had once been avoidance, warmth where there had been walls. It wasn't perfect, not even close, but it was progress, and that alone gave her hope she hadn't dared to feel in years. Still, healing was not a straight line. Charlotte struggled with old instincts, moments when her pride flared or her guilt threatened to pull her backward. Robert had days where memories resurfaced, leaving him guarded and distant. But the difference now was simple. Neither of them ran. They stayed. They talked. They tried. And in that effort, something new quietly grew between them. One evening, after finishing another small project together, Robert watched Charlotte drive away and felt a sense of cautious optimism settle in his chest. The emotional scars between them hadn't vanished, but they were no longer the defining force. They were marks of what had been survived, not symbols of what would always remain broken. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe it fully. Their relationship was no longer drifting. It was rebuilding. Slowly, imperfectly, and beautifully. The second crisis struck on a quiet Tuesday morning, just when life had begun to feel stable again. Sarah collapsed in the kitchen while preparing breakfast, her breathing shallow, her skin pale. Robert found her moments later, barely conscious, and his voice shook as he called Charlotte and Jard before rushing her to the hospital. Panic tightened his chest as doctors wheeled her through double doors, and the sterile hallway suddenly felt suffocating. He stood alone at first, gripping the back of a plastic chair, trying to steady his hands. Charlotte arrived 20 minutes later, breathless, hair tied back hastily, eyes wide with fear. She didn't hesitate, she moved to her father's side immediately. What happened? How long was she out? What did the doctor say? Her questions fired rapidly, her tone sharp with urgency. But Robert, already overwhelmed, bristled at the barrage. "Charlotte," he said tightly, "I don't know yet. They're still running tests." She stepped back, realizing her instinct to control the moment had flared again. Old habits resurfaced in the heat of panic, and Robert felt the sting of past wounds, times when she bulldozed over his voice, assuming she knew best. The echoes of their old dynamic throbbed painfully between them. But this time, something was different. Charlotte caught herself. She inhaled, forced her shoulders to relax, and approached again, not with dominance but with calm intention. "Okay," she said quietly, "then let's wait together." They sat side by side, tense but united by worry. Old wounds simmered beneath the surface, threatening to rise again, yet both fought to keep them buried under the urgency of the moment. When the doctor finally emerged with updates, Charlotte listened intently without interrupting, letting Robert ask the questions. Sarah had suffered a severe arrhythmia and needed monitoring, medication adjustments, and possibly further evaluation. The news was frightening but hopeful. She was stable for now. As the doctor left, Robert released a shaky breath. Charlotte reached out, gently placing a hand on his arm. "Dad, she's going to be okay. We'll get through this." The reassurance was genuine, and it steadied him. Throughout the day, Charlotte stepped up in ways Robert didn't expect. She organized Sarah's medications, spoke calmly with the nurses, made sure paperwork was filled out correctly. But she didn't overstep. She checked in with Robert before making decisions, asked his opinion before acting, and deferred to him when something felt too sensitive. Her restraint, her maturity, her respect, it all struck him deeply. Meanwhile, Jard remained close but intentionally stepped back. He sensed that this wasn't a moment to mediate. It was a moment for father and daughter to face the lingering cracks in their relationship while standing on the same side for once. He supported quietly, grabbing coffee, making calls, handling logistics, but left emotional space for Robert and Charlotte to navigate the crisis together. David, interestingly, didn't appear at all. He didn't call, didn't check in, didn't ask if Charlotte needed support. His absence, which once would have shaken her, instead brought clarity. She didn't miss his voice. She didn't crave his approval. In fact, she realized how different this moment felt without the weight of his expectations. She wasn't acting to impress anyone. She wasn't performing strength. She was simply being present for her family, the one she had nearly lost. As hours passed, Robert found himself studying Charlotte in the small, quiet moments. The way she wiped her eyes discreetly after speaking with a nurse, the way she sat close to Sarah's bedside whispering gentle reassurances, the way she didn't collapse into panic or guilt. She simply stayed steady. He saw growth in her, real growth. And though frustration still flickered at times, he understood something important. She was no longer the woman who dismissed him. She was trying, not perfectly, not seamlessly, but genuinely, to be better, to be a daughter. Late that evening, Sarah finally stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Charlotte leaned forward immediately, squeezing her mother's hand. Robert stood on the other side, relief washing through him so quickly it nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. Sarah's weak smile was enough to unravel the knots inside both of them. When Sarah drifted back to sleep, Robert stepped into the hallway with Charlotte. The FL. Fluorescent lights cast soft shadows across her face, and for a long moment neither spoke. "You handled today well," Robert said at last. "Better than I expected, better than I could have asked." Charlotte swallowed, emotion tightening her throat. "I just wanted to do right by her and by you." "You did," he said simply. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't flowery. But for Charlotte, it was everything. And for Robert, it was proof, solid, undeniable, that she had changed. As they walked back into Sarah's room together, something unspoken settled between them, gentle and steady. For the first time in years, they didn't feel like fractured pieces trying to reconnect. They felt like a family, tentatively, imperfectly, but undeniably finding their way back. The hospital crisis had shaken something loose in both Robert and Charlotte. A few days after Sarah returned home, still weak but recovering, father and daughter met again, this time not out of necessity, not out of conflict, but by choice. They sat on the back porch of Robert's home, the late afternoon sunlight stretching long shadows across the wooden boards. The air felt still, almost expectant, as if the world itself understood that this was a moment they had avoided for too many years. Charlotte was the first to break the silence. "Dad, we need to talk about what happens next, not just with Mom, but with us." Robert nodded slowly. "I know." What followed wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't an apology. It was two people, finally facing each other without armor. Charlotte spoke honestly about how torn she had felt growing up, caught between Robert's quiet, steady expectations and David's loud, polished presence. She admitted that she thought she needed to choose, that success in David's world required shrinking or overriding the version of herself that belonged with Robert. "I kept thinking I had to be someone else to be respected," she said softly. "Someone tougher, someone colder, someone he approved of." Robert listened, eyes lowered, his thumb tapping lightly against the armrest. When she finished, he confessed what he had kept buried for years. "I wasn't easy to approach," he said. "I thought giving you space meant giving you freedom. I didn't realize it looked like distance." He swallowed, the truth thick in his throat. "And when you drifted, I told myself it was normal, even when it hurt." It was the first time he had ever admitted that aloud. Charlotte's breath hitched, emotion welling at the idea that her father, strong, stoic Robert, had felt abandoned long before their blowout. For the first time, she saw not just the wounds she carried, but the ones she inflicted. Jard joined them briefly, bringing glasses of cold water, then sat quietly nearby. He wasn't there to mediate, He had learned better than that. Instead, he became the grounding force, the steady presence who encouraged conversation simply by being calm, open, and non-intrusive. "You're both doing the work," he said gently after a pause. "Just keep talking, keep listening, you're closer than you think." Robert gave him a faint nod of gratitude. Charlotte reached for Jard's hand, squeezing it once before letting go, returning her full attention to her father. But the peace they were building wasn't free from interference. David, sensing the shift, made one last attempt to reclaim influence. He called Charlotte that evening, tone dripping with condescension masked as concern. "I hear you're spending a lot of time with your father again," he said. "I just hope you're not being too forgiving. People like him take advantage of second chances." Charlotte didn't react with anger. She didn't defend him or argue. Instead, she simply said, "David, my relationship with my father is mine, not yours." For the first time, he had no response. His irrelevance was becoming undeniable. Days later, Sarah suggested they all have dinner together. Just a simple meal, nothing extravagant. Robert hesitated but eventually agreed. Charlotte, nervous but determined, arrived early to help set the table and prepare food. Jard stood by her side, quietly supportive, while Sarah moved slowly around the kitchen, smiling at the warmth that was slowly returning to her home. The meal began stiffly. Conversation was polite, careful, almost brittle. Robert found himself speaking in measured tones, unsure how much to reveal. Charlotte watched him closely, monitoring his reactions, trying not to overstep. But as dishes passed, as laughter bubbled awkwardly then genuinely, the stiffness softened. Midway through dinner, Robert did something unexpected. He opened up. "I worry," he said quietly, eyes focused on his plate, "that if something goes wrong again, you'll leave. That this is temporary, that I'll lose you a second time." The table fell silent, not tense, just deeply, profoundly still. Charlotte placed her fork down and looked directly at him. "Dad," she said, voice breaking, "I'm not going anywhere. Not again. I didn't understand Biff. But I do now. And I'm here because I want to be, not out of guilt, not out of obligation." Her words settled around them like warm light. Robert didn't speak immediately, but something shifted in his posture, subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders lowered, his breath eased. The fear he had carried for years loosened its grip. By the end of the night, the atmosphere had transformed. The tension wasn't gone, but it no longer defined the room. In its place was a delicate, cautious hope. A new kind of bond, fragile but real, had begun to take shape between father and daughter. As Charlotte hugged her mother goodbye and prepared to leave, she paused in the doorway, looking back at Robert. "We'll talk tomorrow?" she asked softly. Robert nodded, "Yeah, tomorrow." And for the first time, tomorrow felt like a promise they could both keep. The days that followed felt different, quietly, undeniably different. Robert and Charlotte were no longer tiptoeing around the fragile remains of their old relationship. Instead, they moved with a careful but steady confidence, as if both had silently agreed to stop looking backward and start building something new. Their conversations grew warmer. Their tones softened. There were still moments of hesitation, still shadows of old habits, but for the first time in years, they communicated without bracing for conflict. And that shift, that shared willingness, became the foundation of their new chapter. Charlotte made a conscious effort to show her father he mattered, not through extravagant gifts or gestures meant to impress, but through the small, meaningful things she had neglected for years. She took him out for lunch at a diner he used to bring her to when she was a child, a simple place with vinyl seats and a jukebox in the corner. She invited him on quiet weekend walks, letting him choose the route. She remembered his birthday, really remembered it, and surprised him with a homemade cake rather than something expensive and impersonal. She also began offering practical help, organizing his medical files after a checkup, cleaning out the garage with him, repairing the broken light above his porch. Every gesture, every small act carried the same message: I see you now. Robert, although still cautious, felt the sincerity in each action. He didn't rush to embrace every change, but he didn't resist them either. Slowly, gently, he allowed himself to receive her care, something he'd forgotten how to do. Jard watched all of this with quiet reflection. He saw his wife humbled, softened, opened by the work she'd done on herself. And he saw Robert, once guarded and wounded, inching toward a version of himself that had been buried beneath disappointment. It was like watching two people learn a new language together, haltingly at first, then with growing fluency. One evening, as Charlotte returned from visiting her father, Jard asked, "How did it go today?" She smiled in a way he hadn't seen in years. "Good," she said. "Hard sometimes, but good." Jard nodded thoughtfully. He had once feared that their marriage would forever be strained by the fractures between Robert and Charlotte, that the emotional debris would seep into every corner of their lives. Now, seeing them rebuilding, he realized healing wasn't a single moment. It was a series of moments, layered and imperfect, stitched together by willingness and effort. For the first time, he believed their future as a family was possible. David, however, felt the shift acutely and painfully. His calls became more frequent, his tone more demanding. When he finally confronted Charlotte, irritation simmering beneath his polished exterior, he said, "I hope you're not forgetting everything I've done for you. Robert may be your father, but I've been there too." Charlotte didn't lash out. She didn't argue or defend herself. Instead, she answered with calm certainty, "My relationship with my father is mine to rebuild. It's my priority now." David's expression tightened. He tried to reassert control, offering advice she didn't ask for and opinions she no longer valued. His influence, once so powerful, felt hollow now, an echo fading in the distance. And Charlotte, for the first time, didn't feel torn. She felt free. Sarah, watching her husband and daughter bridge years of distance, felt a relief she thought she'd never experience again. The weight she had carried, the fear that her family would remain fractured forever, finally began to lift. She didn't expect perfection. She didn't need them to forget the past. She only needed them to move forward without pain poisoning every step. And they were. Robert, meanwhile, felt lighter than he had in years. With his emotional burden loosening, he began reclaiming parts of himself he had abandoned long ago. He took up woodworking again, spending quiet afternoons smoothing old planks into something new. He started taking scenic drives, discovering towns he had always meant to visit. He allowed himself to enjoy moments without waiting for them to collapse. The anger that once shadowed his days had softened into acceptance. The hurt that had once consumed him had transformed into understanding. And beneath it all was something he hadn't dared to feel. Hope. Hope for tomorrow. Hope for his family. Hope for a future not defined by what had broken them, but by what they chose to rebuild. They weren't fully healed, not yet. The scars remained, reminders of a painful journey, but scars also signaled survival, growth, the beginning of something stronger. And slowly, surely, the Hayes family began learning how to live again, how to forgive, how to love quietly, imperfectly, but earnestly. The weight was lifting. The path ahead was open. And tomorrow, for the first time in years, looked bright. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in years. No tension in the walls, no sharp breaths waiting to turn into arguments, just a soft, late afternoon stillness that settled gently over every room. Robert sat in his armchair, hands folded loosely, when Charlotte walked in. She hesitated at the doorway before taking the seat across from him. For the first time, there was no distance in her posture, no defensiveness hidden behind her gaze. Just a daughter ready, finally, to speak with her father as if the past didn't have to dictate the future. "Dad," she began softly, "can we talk?" Robert nodded, "Of course." For a few seconds, silence stretched between them, not heavy but fragile, like something waiting to be tended to. When Charlotte finally exhaled, it sounded like she was releasing years of weight. "I've been wanting to say this for a long time," she said, "but I wasn't ready, or maybe I was afraid of what you'd say back." She looked down at her hands, then met his eyes again. "I'm sorry, Dad, truly. I took your love for granted. I thought you'd always be there, no matter how I acted. And it wasn't until everything almost fell apart, until I almost lost you, that I realized how deeply I'd hurt you." The words weren't rehearsed. They came out uneven and trembling, which made them real. Robert's chest tightened, not with anger but with something gentler, something quieter. He had waited years for accountability, for acknowledgement, but strangely, he didn't feel triumphant. He simply felt at peace. "You don't owe me perfection, Charlotte," he said, voice steady but warm. "Just honesty, and this, what you're saying now, that's enough." Charlotte shook her head lightly, tears forming. "It's not just that. I hurt myself too. I kept chasing approval from people who didn't really know me because I was too scared to face you, to face what I'd broken between us." Robert leaned back, letting her words settle. He realized something important. Forgiveness had already begun long before this conversation. It was in the lunches they shared, the projects they worked on, the crises they survived together. This moment wasn't the beginning. It was the acknowledgement of what had quietly grown between them for months. He nodded slowly. "And I wasn't easy," he admitted. "I shut down, pulled away. I thought keeping my feelings to myself was the best way to avoid hurting you. But all it did was make you feel like I didn't care. I should have said something sooner. I should have fought harder for us." Charlotte wiped her cheek, a shaky smile forming. "We both made mistakes." "We did," Robert agreed. "But we're here now, and that's what matters." It wasn't dramatic, but it didn't need to be. Their shared vulnerability filled the room with the kind of warmth that had been missing for far too long. They weren't trying to rewrite history. They weren't pretending the wounds hadn't been deep. They were simply acknowledging what had been broken and choosing, together, to move forward. A quiet knock sounded at the doorway and Sarah peeked in. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. The relief in her eyes was unmistakable. For years, she had carried the burden of watching her family fracture, unsure if anything would ever repair the divide. Now, seeing the two people she loved most speaking openly, honestly, gently, she felt hope flicker inside her for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "You two all right?" she asked softly. Robert nodded. Charlotte gave a small laugh, brushing away another tear. "Yeah, Mom, we're all right." Sarah stepped into the room, taking in the sight of father and daughter finally sitting without tension pressing between them. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. It was real, raw, earned. And that made it more meaningful than anything she had dared to imagine. Charlotte reached out, placing her hand over Robert's. "I don't want to lose this again," she whispered. Robert covered her hand gently. "You won't." The moment lingered, quiet, steady, full of something that felt like a promise. A legacy not built on bitterness, but on forgiveness. Not on perfection, but on effort. Not on the pain that had divided them, but on the understanding that now brought them back together. And as they sat there, three imperfect people choosing each other again, there was a sense that the hardest parts of their journey were behind them. The future wasn't guaranteed, but it was theirs. Final line. Robert and Charlotte walked into the future together, their bond stronger than ever, their hearts healed by the power of forgiveness, and the quiet promise that, no matter what, they would face the world side by side.